Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Peter Smallage. I'm the New York State Extension Forester. It's my pleasure to bring you this monthly webinar series, the Forest Connect webinar series. It's part of the broader array of things that we do within Forest Connect. And today we have a guest speaker, David Moore. David is a graduate student at the University of New Hampshire. And I've known of David and the things that he's been involved with now for a couple of years. And I had a fortuitous prompt from Steve Robarge, who's the extension forester in New Hampshire, and said, "Hey, check this out. Great webinar speaker." And I thought this is great. This is something I've wanted to learn more about, and I think that obviously there's a group of you all that are interested in this as well. So with that, I am going to just mute my microphone. I'm going to hover in the background and turn it over to David. So David, welcome. Thank you very much for being part of this. We look forward to your presentation about harvesting sap and producing syrup from trees other than maples. Welcome.
Awesome, Peter. Thank you so much for having me, and everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I hope this will be useful, and I will just start off by saying before I was a graduate student, I had I guess small to medium sized syrup business. I made birch syrup. I started making sycamore syrup to the end. So I like to I try to really make sure that all my work is really has a strong applied component because that's really what my background is. Um, so today I'm going to talk about harvesting sap and producing syrup from trees other than maples. Now I want to focus my talk, of course, on other types of species, but I think it would be useful to give a brief overview on maples and some general tree physiology, wood anatomy kind of ideas. And so, of course, maple trees are tapped, depending on where you are, somewhere in the late summer, early spring, during the winter dormancy when they're leafless. You drill a little hole in the tree, and pressure is built up inside the tree, which causes sap to drip out. And then we harvest that sap and we concentrate it either with heat. You can see these pictures of these evaporators, wood-fired or propane-fired evaporators, or, excuse me, with what we call reverse osmosis. Reverse osmosis is used, extensively in the syrup industry, but also people use it in their kitchens to purify water. Basically, what it is it's this extremely fine membrane. And when you pressurize sap or water or whatever, the holes in the membrane are so small that only water molecules can pass through. Anything bigger than a water molecule, sugar, minerals, amino acids, all these different things cannot pass through. And so what you get is you get pure water on one side and what we call permeate. And then on the other side, we get concentrate. This is all the stuff that didn't pass through. And so, of course, in your kitchen, you're interested in the pure water, the permeate, but syrup producers are interested in the concentrate. And so reverse osmosis is a nice way to save energy costs, um, basically using electricity in this reverse osmosis machine to concentrate sap before you heat it up. Um, so as I said, we tap trees during winter dormancy. Um, and if I can just say a couple words about that, during the growing season, trees are photosynthesizing. Deciduous trees have their leaves, they're photosynthesizing, they're constantly taking in carbon and making sugar and immediately turning that sugar into starch to store it. At the end of the growing season, at the onset of dormancy, a lot of that stored starch is broken down into sugar. And the reason for that is, first of all, when you have a lot of freezing over the winter, that sugar will actually act as a cryoprotectant and it can essentially lower the freezing point of sap to protect the tissue a little bit. And the other thing that accomplishes is, photosynthesis is only really happening um, primarily during the growing season, but respiration, which is the burning of sugar to allow cells to carry out all their different functions, that happens consistently throughout the whole year as long as conditions are right. And so that respiration, which is the same thing that we do, humans do, that process continues throughout winter dormancy when conditions are right. And so the tree needs a stockpile of sugar to make it through winter dormancy. So that's why we see sugar contents in the sap increase during the winter. And then, of course, to produce syrup, we have to concentrate it. We use heat or reverse osmosis. Um, I'm sure I don't have to sell this to you guys, but syrup is an important industry. Um, Almost 20,000 gallons of maple syrup were produced in Canada this past year, and of course, more than 90% is from Quebec. And then in the United States, almost six sorry, did I say thousand? I meant to say million. So in the United States, almost 6 million gallons of maple syrup were produced, and generally about half of that comes from the state of Vermont, where maple trees grow very well. It takes about 40 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of syrup from a maple tree, a sugar maple tree. And typically, we get about, on average, a third of a gallon of maple syrup from each tap. So that means, on average, each year you're getting about over 100 gallons of sap from each tap over the course of many weeks. So I just want to kind of come at this from a physiological standpoint. When you tap a tree, there's so much pressure in the tree when after it freezes and when it starts to thaw, so much pressure is built up that sap actually drips out. And there's an ecological, a biological reason why that pressure is being built up. And the reason is embolism repair. And so I just want to explain that concept. Um, During a growing season, late in the summer, maybe there's a drought. And so the tree experiences some water stress. And so what happens when the tree is experiencing water stress is the sap in the sapwood, the sap in the xylem will be under a lot of tension, negative pressure. And at some point, if there's any gas dissolved in the sap, the gas will come out of solution and expand to take up space to relieve that tension. Um, and that's a process called cavitation, the formation of gas bubbles in sap due to water stress. If those gas bubbles are large enough to actually fill up the diameter of a vessel, then we call them embolisms because they restrict sap flow. And because they restrict sap flow, they're actually harmful to trees. If trees experience a lot of embolism, they will be much less capable of transporting water. And so many species of plants have mechanisms to repair embolisms. And for maples and some of these other species that we'll talk about today, that mechanism is carried out during winter dormancy. And what happens is just very large pressures are built up with the goal of redissolving those gas bubbles, those embolisms, so that come the springtime, those vessels will be in good shape, ready to transport water when the new leaves come out. In maples, the process is very complex. I'll just explain it briefly, but if anyone wants more information, I can share with Peter a good paper to read. Um, you can see here this flow chart. There's a small fiber next to a larger vessel. And so these the vessels are where the sap is. The fibers in sugar maples are gas filled. And so when the temperature freezes, when the temperature decreases, if you think back to chemistry class, the ideal gas law, when temperature decreases, pressure decreases, volume decreases. And so the gas in this fiber shrinks, it drops in pressure, and it pulls stuff across that membrane into the fiber. But just like a reverse osmosis machine, this membrane between the fiber and the vessel is only permeable to water. So all the sugar is left behind in the sap and just pure water moves in. And when the pure water moves in, the freezing point is a little bit higher now because there's no sugar in the sap. And so the water freezes. And because the water freezes, it does not inhibit the movement of more water into that fiber. So water will continue to move into that fiber. If it stayed as a liquid, that amount of water in there would, just because of the high concentration of water, would kind of prevent more water from moving in. But it freezes and continues to move in. And notably, the gas in the fiber doesn't it not enough water moves in to actually dissolve that gas bubble in the fiber because there's still a rich sugary solution on the other side that's kind of acting um, as a um, just preventing total influx of water into the fiber. So that's what's happening on a micro scale. On a macro scale, when this is happening all over the sapwood, this pressure decrease, water moving into the fibers, that means that water has to move into the tree to take up space. And since there's no leaves, the tree is essentially closed to the atmosphere. So water moves in through the roots. And then during a thaw cycle, the opposite happens. So the water in the fiber melts, the gas in the fiber expands, all of that material is forced back into the vessel. And so this is when you get very, very large pressures being built up, and water is now moving back down the tree as these gas bubbles expand and that ice melts. Um, so I have some data here I just wanted to quickly show with you. This is a graph of from one tree. We use sap flow sensors to monitor sap flow. And what I've done here is in blue, I've plotted sap flow, and in red, plotted wood temperature at the same exact point where I'm measuring sap flow. And you can see here, anytime the red line crosses over this zero threshold, anytime 0 degrees Celsius, so the freezing point of water, anytime the temperature crosses over there, sap's going to move. If you have a prolonged period, like in the middle of this graph, where the temperature is always above freezing, and you can't see it here, but if the temperature were below freezing for a while, you wouldn't see sap flow. You only see it when that freezing point is crossed. And if you look very closely, you'll see that when there's a thaw, the sap moves up, and when there's a sorry, did I say that correctly? When there's a freeze, I got that backward. When there's a freeze, the sap moves up, and when there's a thaw, the sap moves down. If you can see that, if you kind of zoom in on one of these freeze thaw events, you should be able to see that. So that's consistent with what I was explaining on the last slide. I've plotted here sap flow from many different sap flow sensors at different depths in the tree, and you can see how a lot of these events where you get these high flow events, they're typically toward the outside, at most maybe 5 centimeters deep. The deeper depths experience less freezing and thawing. And that's just because they're farther from the outside of the tree, so they're more protected from the extreme temperatures. And since we rely on freezing and thawing, those outer sapwood depths are where most of the activity takes place. And here's just one more graph showing the variability in sap flow. You get quite a bit up to about, in this tree, maybe 5 centimeters, in this tree, 7, but beyond that, there's not very much. So, to make a long story short, freeze-thaw cycles are what really drive sap pressurization and sap flow in sugar maples in all maple species during winter dormancy. Okay, I want to take a few minutes to talk about wood anatomy. This will be relevant, I think, a little bit for the rest of my talk too, specifically wood porosity. So when I say hardwood, I'm talking about maples, birches, oaks, ashes, most of the trees around here that aren't conifers. So I just want to make the distinction that aren't, pines, hemlocks, larches, all these different things. So I'm talking specifically about hardwoods. Um, and so the three different wood porosities that I want to introduce are ring porous, diffuse porous, and semi-ring porous. Here's a micrograph of the three different wood porosities, ring porous, semi-ring porous, and diffuse porous, you can see the different patterns. And I'll talk briefly about each one. So this is ring porous. Examples of ring porous trees include oaks and ashes. Um, and ring porous trees, if I were to look at one growth ring, it would contain very large diameter vessels, and then there'd be an abrupt transition, this abrupt boundary, and then a bunch of small diameter vessels. So in the early spring, when there's a lot of water around, the tree uses these large diameter vessels. It grows these brand new large diameter vessels to be able to move all that water. Later in the summer, when water is more scarce, the tree transitions and starts producing these small diameter vessels instead. And small diameter vessels are um, advantageous because those small vessels, they have a lot of surface area. There's a lot of good capillary action, so they can really hang on to water very well. Whereas these large diameter vessels embolize much more easily because water is just, without a lot of water around, it's difficult to keep those vessels filled. So we call this band of large vessels, we call it early wood because it's the first new wood that grows during the year. And then the late wood contains all the small diameter stuff. So this is the strategy used by oaks and ashes and a few other species around here. Um, the next category is semi-ring porous. I think the only species I know, at least in my region, that exhibits this wood porosity are the walnuts. And so the only difference here is that instead of an abrupt transition between early wood and late wood, large and small vessels, it's a gradual transition, as you can kind of see here from this picture. But the same principles apply in the at the toward the end of the growing season. It's those small vessels are used to retain water at the expense of being able to move a lot of it, which is why those large vessels are nice. And then the last category is diffuse porous. And diffuse porous is different because across the entire growing season, all the vessels are always small diameter. It doesn't have a transition between different sizes. So diffuse porous, I would say most of the hardwoods around here are diffuse porous. It includes maples, birches, cherries, poplars, so on and so forth. Now, one other thing I should mention about wood porosity is that I want to draw another distinction between ring porous and diffuse porous species. So ring porous species, again, like oaks, ashes, these are trees that add new radial growth before they leaf out. And so because they add new radial growth before they leaf out, those new buds, when they break, they're being fueled by water that's moving through brand new tissue. So there's no chance that it would have embolized already. It's brand new, and those leaves come after the new tissue has grown. So there's no, so that's great. Now, in contrast, diffuse porous species, typically in general, leaf out before that new radial growth happens. And so as a consequence, they have to use tissue from previous years to move water at the beginning of the season when the leaves are expanding. So hopefully that makes sense. I see a question here. Are vessels the same as xylem and phloem? So xylem and phloem are different. Phloem is a very thin band just inside the bark, but most of the wood is all xylem. Xylem includes sapwood, which is the functioning stuff for transporting water, and then heartwood, which is the older stuff that is no longer functioning. So phloem, the function of phloem is to transport sugars, photosynthates around the plant, whereas the function of xylem, which is most of the tissue in the trunk, is to transport water. Um, so again, thinking about these different wood porosities, because diffuse porous trees like maples, birches, cherries, because diffuse porous trees have to use previous year's growth rings to transport water to the emerging leaves, then those species, at least in my mind, I think that they must be more likely to have embolism repair mechanisms during the winter because it's essential that at least some of those older vessels are functioning properly so the tree can use those. And that seems to be consistent with what I found. I mean, of course, most of the syrup producing species, maples, birches, I'll get into this later, but most of those are diffuse porous with some exceptions. And here's a picture of sugar maple under the microscope, and you can see these large holes are the vessels, and then all these tiny things surrounding it are the fibers. And then, of course, there's some to the right, you can see some parenchyma, which are living storage tissues in the xylem. Okay, so continuing with wood anatomy, I want to mention that when you tap a tree and you drill a hole into the tree, you sever all those xylem vessels that go up and down in that area. And that hole can be an entry point for gas bubbles, new gas bubbles, or pathogens. And so the tree undergoes this process called compartmentalization. It essentially walls off all that tissue right around the tap hole from the rest of the plant to prevent things from spreading. And so it builds barriers um, that that it basically plugs up all the holes on all those xylem vessels that are connected to that tap hole. And because xylem vessels go up and down, that wound does not really spread much to the back or side to side, but that wound can be quite tall. You can see here this piece of lumber, this tap hole lumber. It's sideways, but if you were to stand it straight up, you could see that the wounded region doesn't really extend out to the sides too much, but it, can extend, a few feet, potentially above and below the tap hole. Excuse me, and that's just because those vessels are oriented up and down. Um, Now, non-conductive wood is what we call these dark brown stained regions because they're no longer used for water transport. So if a tree has a big non-conductive wood column, that means that it didn't do a great job walling off the wounded tissue. It lost a lot of functioning tissue. On the other hand, if a tree has a really small non-conductive wood column, then it did a very good job compartmentalizing, a very good job walling off that wounded tissue from the rest of the plant, um, because it did not lose very much of the functioning tissue. It preserved all that tissue. Um, in sugar maples, there's been some really great work from the University of Vermont showing how, as in most biological systems, there's a lot of variability. But on average, non-conductive wood columns are about 50 times the volume of tap holes. And that seems pretty big, pretty substantial. And it is. I mean, the tree is losing a decent amount of conductive tissue each year when you tap it. However, fear not, because I'm sure many of you have visited well-managed sugar bushes, and you walk around and you look at those trees, and they're very vigorous, very healthy, beautiful trees. And basically, if you follow tapping guidelines, you then the amount of new radial growth each year will compensate for it will exceed the amount of tissue that you lose each year due to tapping. So that's kind of the theory behind tapping guidelines and sustainable tapping is at least in part thinking about how much conductive tissue is lost, how much conductive tissue is added each year, and making sure there's a balance. And of course, there's other things going on. Trees could incur other wounds during the year. Of course, a little bit of sapwood is transitioning to heartwood, so there's other factors as well. But again, if you follow tapping guidelines, then even though you're losing a little bit of tissue each year, the trees will still be very healthy and very vigorous. And as I mentioned, compartmentalization, the act of plugging up all those holes, all those pores, it takes energy for the tree. And so some species have are better at compartmentalizing, whereas other species, as we'll talk about shortly, tend to have much larger non-conductive wood columns. They don't have as strong of a wound response. Here's another view. This is a cross section instead of I guess a radial section like the piece of lumber before, seeing how many tap holes this tree has had over the year. And actually, I'll just mention this is a great picture because as you can see, if you start in one location in the tree and each year move your tap hole around a little bit, by the time you get back to the beginning, hopefully, if this tree is at all healthy and growing well, then that old non-conductive wood column from your first tap hole, it should be sufficiently buried so that there's plenty of new tissue and you won't risk hitting it when you drill that new hole when you get back to the beginning. As you can see, there are a few holes here where they did actually um, the holes met, and so you're going to have a yield decrease as a consequence. But that's at least in theory what should be happening. All right, so now that we've had all this background, I want to start getting into all the different species that you can use for syrup production. And as you can see here, this pyramid, of course, at the top of the hierarchy is maple. I cited earlier, production amounts, and it's, of course, a very important industry in this region, northeastern North America. Um, you know, in part due to the fact that these trees produce a lot of sap. The sap is very sweet, so the sap to syrup ratio, 40 to 1 sounds like a lot, but once we start talking about some of these other species, I think you'll understand why maple is really, really preferred. And of course, the taste is great, and it's kind of part of our culture a little bit. Um, so maple's certainly far and away at the top, although there are some other species that are economically important. And number two, without a doubt, is birch trees. Birch syrup is actually, I didn't know this when I was getting into this, but in northern latitudes where maples don't grow, birch syrup is actually a very important industry. And there are some producers, birch syrup producers, who tap literally hundreds of thousands of trees and have massive operations. So it is, it's definitely an economically important crop. Number three is walnut. Walnut, again, there's a big step down from birch, but walnut, there's a handful of commercial walnut syrup producers. I think the biggest one taps between 1,000 and 2,000 trees, something like that. And then I put beech and sycamore one more tier down. I only know of one commercial beech syrup producer and one commercial sycamore syrup producer, but they're out there. And then on the last tier, I included some species um, that are possible for syrup production, but it's just not done commercially yet anyway. So now, just to be very clear, I am certainly not suggesting that anything will displace maple in terms of importance. As I mentioned, there's a reason that maple is far and away the most widely produced and consumed syrup. Um, However, I do believe that there is certainly, absolutely, without a doubt, room in the market for these other syrups. Um, my good friend Mike Farrell um, said that um, these different types of syrup, birch syrup, walnut syrup, they actually don't really compete with maple because people find out that people who love maple syrup, find out that you can produce syrup from other types of trees. And they think to themselves, "Oh, that's really cool. I'd love to try that. I love maple syrup. Let's try some of these other syrups." And so, um, yeah, and of course, there's other potential things too. Maybe I'll wait and talk about those things more. Oh well, here we go. I'll get into them now. You may be thinking, if maple's so great, why are we even bothering? And I can think of many different reasons. One is the different flavors. There are actually some new flavors that are being developed just because people are tapping new types of trees. So all these different types of trees each have, some of them taste pretty similar to maple. Others actually taste quite a bit different, and they're all very unique. So a lot of consumers and also chefs, more experimental, progressive chefs are also really excited about this. I worked with, several chefs when I was making birch syrup, and it was just fascinating to see what they would do. Um, Another very important point, I think, is that um, often these different types of trees will yield sap due to different environmental cues. So maybe freezing and thawing is not important for a certain species, which means that a poor maple year in your region may not also be a poor birch year or something like that. So in that sense, when you diversify like that, then you're sort of protecting your portfolio a little bit, your agronomic portfolio. And then, of course, um, there's thinking about where do these trees actually grow? Sugar maples are a little bit picky with where they grow. They like nice, rich soils, a little more alkaline, rich in organic matter and base cations like calcium. Red maples are very much generalists. They'll grow in swampy areas, dry areas, everywhere in between. But then, um, some of the species we'll talk about co-occur with maples, but others grow in vastly different types of places. And so that means that, if you don't have maple on your property, maybe you'll have another one of these species or nearby or something that will be available to you. Oh, so I see some good questions here. I've never tried tapping sassafras before. I have monitored it with sap flow sensors. And the thing with sassafras, I like to come at this a little bit from a phylogenetic perspective. And so I'm talking about hardwoods. And I've only really focused on what we call dicotyledonous plants. Sassafras is a more primitive plant with a little bit different. Sassafras, tulip poplar is another example of more primitive plant that doesn't have the same kind of characteristics as far as wood porosity goes. Toxic sap, very soon I'll start to do some more chemical analyses. I know that willow, I believe, has some salicylic acid, and I know the inner bark was from willow was the original aspirin, so salicylic acid, and I can't imagine that wouldn't end up in the sap. Um, Actually, while I'm on this, maybe I'll just expand just a little more on this thought because I think it's relevant. Um, and I'll certainly address the different species of birch, and I don't really know much about big leaf. Okay, however, I wanted to mention, so when you harvest sap from a tree, of course, it's mostly water, and of course, there's some sugar in it, but there's also a slew of other stuff that's in it. Could be amino acids, it could be phenolic compounds or other types of plant defense compounds, which are used in the compartmentalization process or to ward off microbes, um, different minerals, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of different stuff dissolved in sap. As you either use reverse osmosis or heat to concentrate that sap, what you're doing is you're removing water. And so you remove water, remove water, remove water. And as you continue to remove water, eventually there's not going to be enough water around to dissolve everything that was originally in the sap. And so what happens is that at certain points in the process, stuff that was dissolved in the sap starts to come out of solution. So it will either build up on the bottom of your sap pan as this cakey substance, or maybe float on the surface, this kind of weird looking substance, or maybe it will, if it's gaseous, if it's volatile, it can just volatilize, turn to gas and leave, especially with heat. We call these different things sugar sands because they are the different minerals that were in the sap that come out of solution. So at the end, you're only really left with the most soluble stuff. at each step, the least soluble thing will come out of solution, and you'll um, continually be left with just the most soluble fraction, which mostly happens to be sugars. So that being said, stuff that could be in the sap that may be poisonous um, may not actually end up in syrup. It's really only the most soluble stuff that ends up in syrup when it's finally concentrated. So anyway, all right. So let's start going through these different species. I'm going to kind of follow my hierarchical system and go in that order. So the first one, of course, is birch. Um, I see a question here about vacuum. I'll definitely talk about vacuum at each step too. All right. So economics, as I mentioned, birch syrup is pretty important. 1,000 gallons per year are produced in Alaska on average, and elsewhere too. Canada has several large producers. Um, and I think I mentioned earlier that you get about, on average, of course, there's a lot of variability, but about a third of a gallon, maybe up to a half a gallon if you have a high vacuum system of syrup per tap per year. In birch, that number is down to about a tenth, so quite a bit lower. Like with maples, any species of birch may be used to produce syrup, anything in that Betula genus. Around here, in where I'm from in New Hampshire, we have really three species of birch that get large enough to tap. We have more species of birch, but about three that I would say get large enough to tap repeatedly. One is paper birches, and paper birches or white birches are early successional, and so they require lots of light and they grow quickly and they certainly don't live as long as sugar maples. And then on the other hand, you have black birches and yellow birches, which you find more in a mature forest. They're later successional species. They grow a little more slowly. All these trees are possible candidates for birch syrup production. Um, you remember earlier we were talking about embolism repair. So the reason these large pressures are being built up in maples is to redissolve the gas bubbles, and I walked you through the process at the cellular level, what's happening. This figure here I pulled out of a paper, and I'll explain it first, and then we can look a little more closely at the figure. So in birches, for most of the year, there's no um, osmotic gradient, vertical osmotic gradient. So there's no difference in the sugar concentration in the wood at the top of the tree or at the base. It's all kind of the same. For a very brief period in the early spring, near the end of the dormant season, all of a sudden, um, maybe what's happening is a lot of starch in the canopy is being broken down or hydrolyzed into sugar. And so what happens is at the base of the tree, you still have a low sugar concentration, but near the top of the tree, once you start to get into the branches and the twigs, that tissue has just for a very brief window during the early spring, that tissue up in the canopy has a much higher sugar concentration. And so that creates a vertical or axial osmotic gradient with a low concentration at the base and a very high concentration near the top, which causes water to move up and into that tree. And so that's one of the two things that's facilitating embolism repair in birches is this osmotic gradient across the stem from the ground up to the canopy. And actually, a very similar process happens normally in the roots. The roots of trees like to have a higher concentration of dissolved stuff than the surrounding soil environment, and that causes water to move in via osmosis into the roots. And that builds up what we call root pressure. And so the other thing that's happening in birches is root pressure. The roots maintain also a slightly high concentration, at least higher than the soil, of different solutes, and that allows water to move in and up just a little bit. But in order to get it the rest of the way up the tree, you need this additional help from this osmotic gradient. And again, this is just a very brief, you can see the middle panel, the first couple weeks in April, this develops, but then the rest of the year, In panels, the left and right panels, it's really not present, this gradient. Okay, so I'm going to focus each species thinking about how is production different for each species than it is for maple. So in birch, there's a lot of differences that are really important, especially if you're thinking about making this, and especially if you're thinking about making it commercially. I've talked to many people who didn't realize these things and they kind of gave up. So first of all, the season is shorter. It's only 2 to 3 weeks long. And it also, it birch syrup season basically starts almost the day when maple season ends. So birch syrup production does not rely on freeze-thaw cycle. I usually look in the forecast for when days are in the 50s and nights are in the 30s, nice sunny days. Um, and just to keep in mind from a production standpoint, because the temperatures are a little warmer during this time of year, it's even more essential to store stuff. If you're going to store it for any significant amount of time, you'll definitely want to refrigerate it or process it very quickly, because stuff's really starting to grow at this time of year. Plants are coming up, insects are coming out. So, um, let's see what else. Okay, so I think the number one turnoff to new producers is you assume that you can just use all the same equipment as you were using with maple. And that's not true. With birch, you really have to be careful. You can really only use plastic and stainless steel equipment. And of course, glass bottles are okay too. But other types of metals like galvanized steel, which is like zinc coated, and copper and aluminum, the sap will actually dissolve that, excuse me, and that metal will impart a really, really, really terrible. I mean, the word unpalatable really doesn't do justice. It's really bad off flavor to the syrup. So you can imagine somebody tries that for the first time and they think to themselves, "I'm never going to make this again because it's so bad." But it's just a matter of thinking about what type of equipment you're using. The viscosity birch syrup seems to be a little bit thinner than maple syrup, and so you want to finish it at a slightly higher concentration. Um, and then temperature. So thinking back to chemistry here, maple syrup is overwhelmingly sucrose. It's like 98 or 99% sucrose, something like that. With birch syrup, there's almost no sucrose in it. It's almost completely fructose and glucose. I would say maybe 40, 45% of each, maybe. That's just my very vague recollection. So anyway, so I pulled this table straight out of Wikipedia, and you can see here that fructose starts breaking down at 105 degrees Celsius, which is really not that far off from the boiling point of water, and also kind of in the range of where you would finish your syrup. And so you want to be a little bit cautious about high temperatures when you're boiling um, birch syrup down. And so I highly recommend to anybody who's doing birch syrup, please use reverse osmosis. It's really gonna bring out more of the birch flavor and less of the scorched or burnt kind of any potential off flavors due to temperature. Um, okay, so thinking about non-conductive wood, birch non-conductive wood columns are on average about 220 times the volume of tap holes. So remember that maples were only about 50. So this species has a much weaker, poorer wound response. And I believe that's because it's an early successional species, so it's allocating all of its carbon toward, we say, primary growth, which is like vertical growth, because it's got to shoot up really quickly to outcompete, and then reproduction. And of course, like for example, another example of this species would be a poplar. So these species um, allocate all their carbon toward certain things that are consistent with its life cycle strategies at the expense of things like defense. Okay, so thinking about different birch species, paper birch I found to be the best, although it's, nowhere near the sugar content of a sugar maple. So paper birch is about 1 to 1.2 degrees Brix on average over the course of the season. And then black birch and yellow birch, which are the two larger, more late successional species, tend to be about half that. And so I wrote 100 here, but it should actually be 110 to 1. So 110 to 1 is the sap to syrup ratio of paper birch. And then, of course, the two other species here would be quite a bit higher than that due to the lower concentration. And the taste is very different from maple syrup. I almost consider it, it's a sweet syrup, but I almost consider it more as a savory thing to use with meat or salad or but of course you can bake with it like you would with molasses or something. So just caution people, maybe don't pour it all over your pancakes like you would with maple. Um, and just thinking back, there was a comment about vacuum in the chat box. Maple, birch, and walnut, you don't need a vacuum pump to harvest sap, although it will certainly increase yields. Some of these other species, you will not harvest sap unless you use a vacuum pump, and I'll try to remember to point those out when we come to them. I see a question here about taps per inch in diameter, and the guidelines have been very well developed for maples, but we and others are still working on developing them for these other species, looking at growth rates and other things like that. So hopefully more to come on that in the near future. All right, moving on here. I know we're running low on time, but I'm going to have much less to say about some of these other species. I'll just give a very quick overview. So walnut does rely on freeze-thaw cycles. And I'll just mention, I know you folks probably know this, but the wood is very valuable. So you'll definitely want to think if you want to start tapping them, it's kind of a commitment. Um, the one major difference about walnut syrup is that it contains lots and lots of pectin. So pectin is a plant defense compound. It's involved in plugging up the vessels around the holes. So in that sense, it's a good thing for the tree. However, it's very, very difficult to remove by filtration. Once you remove about half the water, you get this decent film of pectin that forms on the surface of the sap as you're processing it. And you should really remove it. And so people use filters, but it gums up the filters so much. You're always changing filters. It's very difficult. People have tried other things like centrifugation, um, but it doesn't seem like there's a really great solution yet. So if you're going to get into walnut syrup, just be warned that this is something you'll have to deal with. And then some research coming out of West Virginia has shown that the non-conductive wood columns around tap holes for walnuts are actually very, very, very small, only about 8 times, I think about 8 times the volume of tap holes. So these are extremely good, strong compartmentalizers. And yes, you can tap butternut, you can tap anything in the juglans genus, although I would just advise with butternut, I know there's a canker, so you really want to focus on trees that are healthy and growing vigorously. So that's my one recommendation on that. Continuing down the list here, beech. American beech is the one that I've used before. It's great because we often think of it as a weed, but now that it's got all these diseases, I think people are all of a sudden realizing, oh, we want to save it. So with beech, vacuums are absolutely necessary. You won't harvest sap if you just go out and put a tap in and use a basic gravity system. So in my experience, the sap to syrup ratio on this species is about 160 to 1, and the sap sugar concentration seems to be about 0.5 or 0.6 degrees Brix on average. And the syrup's great. Syrup's very, very good. I had a school group tell me that it tasted like chocolate, and they all loved it. So, sycamore, I think so. Sycamore, as many of you know, probably is a floodplain species, which kind of adds an additional challenge to sap harvesting because now you have to bring the sap up out of the valley and to wherever you're going to boil it. Um, so I know for a fact that sycamore is prone to the same metallic off flavor problems as birch. So, and I realized this much to my dismay one year. I had a big batch boiling in an aluminum pan and it turned out awful and I was very disappointed. Um, so, so that's good to know. It's I think it's my favorite type of syrup. The first few times I made it, it was very light, like yellow, gold, light brown color, and it tasted like butterscotch or honey, and it was just so good. I loved it. Um, and this seems to have the same amount of sugar in it that beeches do, but the sap to syrup ratio is about 130 to 1. Um, all right, hophornbeam, also known as ironwood. These are small understory trees in the birch family. Um, very, very hardwood, and these trees grow very slowly. They just kind of hang out in the understory. And therefore, because of those slow growth rates, I think you should either tap them once every several years or use much smaller taps. Because, as I mentioned earlier, in order for tapping to be sustainable, the tree has to add enough radial growth to compensate for what it loses each year due to tapping. So, more information to come about tapping guidelines for these trees. Hop hornbeams seem to run at the same time as birch sap. I've used vacuum every time I've harvested, although other folks have told me that vacuum's not needed for these trees, which is kind of cool. And then the sap sugar concentration is very, very low. I think out of all the species I've tapped, this is probably the lowest. Um, and it's good. It tastes like toffee or caramel, and I'm not sure. It's in the birch family, but I'm not sure if it's prone to the same type of problems with metallic off flavors as birch. I'd like to do a follow-up study on that sometime. Basswood, or linden is another name for this tree. Very soft wood. This tree seems to run during freeze-thaw cycles. Every time I've harvested sap, it's always been following a freeze-thaw cycle. But it's not consistent. It seems to be intermittent, at least in my experience. So, maybe a third or a quarter of the freeze-thaw cycles would yield sap, but not every one. And I'm not sure what other triggers are necessary, but and this also tastes like toffee or caramel, kind of like hophornbeam syrup does. Other types of trees I've heard you can use, but I've never had experience with myself. Mike Farrell, who I mentioned earlier, said that his favorite tasting syrup, at least as of a few years ago, was yellowwood, which is a tree in the legume family. And so that, triggered in my mind, oh, maybe we should think about black locust or honey locust or something else. Although, as somebody mentioned in the chat earlier, I know that plant family has some poisonous concerns too. So we'd want to be cautious about that. And then cottonwood, which is a type of poplar that grows on the West Coast. I've heard that's very good too, syrup. I've also tried tapping many species unsuccessfully. Here's a list of a few of them. And I'm not sure if it's because I'm not doing something right or if it's because it's just not possible at all. And so, um, yep. And then, just kind of thinking more broadly again, I mentioned some reasons why you may want to tap these other trees, diversification, using different landscapes where maples aren't available, so on and so forth. You could even make an argument that, if the seasons don't overlap, like birch and maple, maybe you could reuse a lot of equipment, although that would assume that you're doing it on the same scales. You couldn't really use a 5 foot by 12 foot evaporator that you use for maple on like an 100 tap birch operation. It would be way too big. Um, but it's kind of exciting to think about this, all these new flavors, potential implications for conservation and so on and so forth. So yeah, so I also just want to acknowledge all my my funders and colleagues and friends and family who've been immensely helpful in all this work. So I'm going to end it there, and I know there's a few questions in the chat, but yeah.
David, this was really good. Thank you. Uh, I was just so I'm more familiar with maple than I am with the other species, but still the kind of the angle that you took on the maple was helpful. Lots of good reminders and also some new things like the whole connection between non-conductive wood formed as a result of tapping and the tapping guidelines was I'd never heard that. So that's really that would that's useful to know. So I'm gonna so this is when everybody can start typing in questions. As the host, I get the first at least the first question to make sure I get mine in there. I mean, you answered. I've been taking notes. You answered several of them. So are there and people here will recognize, and you recognize, of course, that a lot of these species, and you mentioned it, will co-occur in the same area. Are there, have you got, are you, maybe you're at, like more of a basic level of research in looking at these trees. So this may be a kind of a premature question, but have you thought about how you can integrate collection systems to, let's say you're not going to have all these species together, but you have maple and basswood together, you have maple and beech together, you may have some maple and walnut together. Are there ways and birch? Are there ways that you could, if you're already a maple producer, how might you adapt your system to optimize the collection of sap from these other species? And then you talked about, and I've heard about it with birch, you may need to process it differently. So how do you like, is there a way, have you wrapped your brain around integrating?
Um, a little bit, not too much. A few things I can say are that, first of all, there are a handful of commercial operations that actually blend different saps together. They'll put on the same tubing line, for example, sycamores and maples. And, just something to keep in mind, thinking about the sap to syrup ratio, because the maple sap to syrup ratio is so much lower. If you tap the same amount of sycamores and maples, it doesn't matter. Your syrup's still going to taste a lot more like maple, just because when it sweetens up, you'll be retained with more of the maple stuff than the sycamore stuff. But yeah, I mean, if you're shooting for, of course, it can be very desirable to keep them separate too. You get to experience more of the pure flavor from each species, and to accomplish that, you need to keep your tubing systems totally separate, have separate tanks. Um, you know, so I think it kind of boils down to a big plumbing problem, and making sure, both in the woods and at the sugar house, you've got all the tanks plumbed in properly, so on and so forth. But I haven't thought about that too hard. That's a good question.
Okay. Um, and then are there ways to, I mean, so I think two really exciting aspects of these alternative tree saps and syrups are one is that for the for the people that own woodlands, they may not have maple, they may not have good site conditions for maple, they may not, they may
Mhm.
have acquired a woodlot that had been high graded and they cut all the maple out, and so they're left with hophornbeam and beech. Uh,
Hmm.
so it gives them an option that they might not otherwise have as an enterprise. But then
Hmm.
for those people that have all the above or multiple of those species, are there marketing strategies? So somebody shows up to your
Hmm.
farm stand and says, "Hey, I know you're a maple producer and I get my maple syrup here every year, and you just started making these one or more of these other alternative sap syrups. How do you spin it so that you can take advantage of that?"
Yeah, that's a really great important question. So I'll speak to my own experience. So I ran my business from like 2009 to 2015 or something. And at the beginning, it was just birch. And I'll be honest, I was the only person doing it in this whole region. I think the next nearest person was somewhere in Ontario or Quebec or maybe even Alaska. I'm not sure. So literally nobody had heard about birch syrup in this area. So the first 1 to 2 years, I spent a lot of time meeting with restaurant chefs and doing, taste tests at farmers markets all around. And that was helpful. But I want to say, maybe 3 years into it or something, we had a really big media year. The AP ran a story on us. We were on New Hampshire Chronicle, all these different things. So all of a sudden I started getting requests, and I realized that the demand is really huge. It's really far outweighs the supply. I really do believe that there's a huge market opportunity here. And thanks to the media sharing, this type of research and whatnot, I think now people are much more aware of it. I know, now I know of probably close to half a dozen birch sear producers just in New England or the northeastern United States alone. And of course, I mentioned beech and sycamore commercial producers, which have come on board in the past decade or so too. So yeah, I mean, it does take some work just getting the word out, but once the word is out, I think there's some excitement there.
Okay, neat. Neat. So, David, now as you move on to these other questions, do you want me to read the questions to you? Can you see them? What's going to be the best
Yes, I
strategy
can
for
I can
you?
see them. So I'm scrolling through them now. Let's see if I'll just pull out the ones I haven't hit yet. So we talked
Okay.
about xylem and phloem, sassafras, toxicity, big leaf. Unfortunately, I know there's a gentleman, I think he's in Oregon, who was doing some big leaf research, and I know there's some excitement out there around it. I'm not sure how much it's um if there's any commercial producers yet or anything, but I know that there's folks definitely interested in that. Um, we talked about the difference between different birches. Our birch sap yield was 1/3 of last year. Could this be due to a dry spring? Um, it it could. My suspicion is that it has more to do with so during my talk, I was talking about what are the environmental drivers of sap flow, sap yield. For maples, it's freezing and thawing. For birches, it's a different temperature cue. So my suspicion is that it has more to do with, did you notice, this is to Deb, Deb, do you notice that, did it happen to be more cloudy this year? Did you not get I kind of anecdotally cited 50s in the day, 30s at night for birch. I don't know if you experienced many of those days. That would be my suspicion. That would be the which would have the largest impact, but it certainly could be due to other factors too. Let's see. Beech trees, yes, beech trees required vacuum. We talked about that. Still more work to be done on tapping guidelines. Let's see what else. Taste of black walnut. Black walnut, it tastes similar to maple. I've mentioned Mike Farrell a few times. Mike used to direct the Cornell maple program, and now he's got a large syrup business in upstate New York. And I remember on the side of his bottle, it says something like he's taught, he does a really good job describing the flavor and talking about how there's some like pear notes and raisin notes and stuff like that. So personally, I would describe it as like maple, but a little bit nutty. Interestingly, from my understanding, if you have a allergy to walnuts, it doesn't matter. You can still um, have walnut syrup, and that could be due to the fact that, as I mentioned, when you go from sap to syrup, a lot of the stuff that's in the sap doesn't end up in the syrup. RO, well, yeah. So the problem with black walnut is all the pectin, and so pectin will gum up whatever you throw at it. So, I love RO because it's a way to concentrate without heat. It can bring out different flavors in the syrup, but black walnut. I mean, I think maybe some really clever, creative, entrepreneurial person will come up with a really slick system to handle all that pectin. But I'm not sure RO is gonna is going to I don't know. I'm still sure you'll still run into problems with RO. Okay, good question about beech bark disease. Yeah, so there's beech bark disease, beech leaf disease. Beech bark disease, from my understanding, is very superficial. Those insects are probably going after the phloem, which is the sugary, rich tissue that's outside of the xylem, outside of the sapwood. And I have read a little bit about it. I certainly don't consider myself an entomologist or a pathologist, but the little bit I've read of it, there's a very thin layer of tissue called the cambium, which separates the sapwood from the phloem. The phloem is on the outside, the sapwood is to the inside. And this layer called the cambium is the very thin layer where new sapwood and new phloem come from, where it originates. And so as the tree grows and grows and grows outward, um, the phloem is part of the bark basically, and the sapwood is the inside of this cambium. So the problem arises if the insect disrupts the cambium where the new xylem are developing, and so those new xylem may be weirdly shapen, mangled in some fashion. However, in my personal experience, more on a more practical level, I've tapped both severely infested trees and trees that seem to be perfectly fine. And I haven't really noticed a difference in either taste or um, yield. I haven't done a statistically robust design to compare the two, but in my experience, it doesn't have a big effect on beech cera production. Balsam poplar, I don't know about balsam poplar. I tried tapping quaking aspen for a year or two unsuccessfully. And quaking aspen is one of the two species I've ever tapped where I've come back the next year and there's mushrooms growing out of it. So, as I mentioned, birch is an early successional species which allocates carbon much more toward primary growth than toward defense. And so, poplar is even more extreme of an example because if you poke a little hole in it, then it has a very poor wound response, very, very poor wound response. Um, I know I mentioned cottonwood as a potential syrup producing tree. I don't know too much about cottonwood, but I know in this region, poplars are typically very early successional and have a poor wound response. And I've never been successful producing syrup from them. Absolutely, I can share this with Peter, and he can disseminate it to the group. Chocolate. The chocolate taste is found maybe a little bit in beech. Not sure about walnut, but maybe. A table. Yeah, that would be really handy to have a table with all this information. Um, so, a lot of my work has been more sap flow, wood anatomy. Um, Sometime I would really like to do a very thorough, comprehensive study on degrees bricks, tracking that over different trees, different sites across the season. I feel like my measurements now, I'm kind of talking about them more anecdotally because I guess I'm not as confident in them as if I were, for example, I mentioned 130 to 1, 160 to 1 for the sap to syrup ratios for a couple species. And, that's just based on my 1 year of data from, 5 or 6 trees. So, um, um, let's see. Grapevines, that's a great question. It's possible to harvest sap from small woody plants too. It would have to be a different system. You can't tap it like you would with a normal maple tree. You would have to, maybe prune it and then attach a tube, somehow couple that with a good seal to the pruned branch or leader or something. I know that grapevines and also, if you can believe it, kiwi berry, hardy kiwi, they bleed an excessive amount of sap when you prune them in during the winter during dormancy. But I've never tried harvesting sap. I'd like to at some point for sure. I heard from a gentleman in New Zealand who had done a lot of sap flow research. He mentioned to me that he thought there was a company in China producing sap as a beverage from kiwis, and I tried looking it up and I couldn't find any information about it. But it's certainly possible. Any woody plant that does this. Um, let's see. Yeah, Norway maple, if you can believe it, Norway maple makes a very, very nice, very pleasant, very good tasting syrup. My lab mate has done quite a bit of work with different maple species, and Norway was one of the trees he looked at. It's a very nice syrup. It's kind of funny because it bleeds that milky sap during the growing season from the leaf, but The sap is clear. It looks just like normal sugar maple sap when you harvest it during the dormant season. So that's definitely Norway is definitely a tree I would recommend trying. Um, oh, birch wine, that sounds good. I know there was a place in New Hampshire that was making mead from maple syrup, and I sold them birch syrup one year too. But I don't think they fermented. This is the thing with fermented products. I'm not sure if they're fermenting the actual syrup or if they're fermenting a different source of sugar or starch and then adding it as a flavoring later. Um, Thank you. I appreciate all the kind words. Yes, please. I love connecting with syrup producers. I'd love to meet them. I've talked a little bit with the gentleman from Tenalloway Farm, who I mentioned, the large walnut syrup producer. I think he's in West Virginia, but I'd love to. Um, I'm sorry. I didn't see the question that you could connect with. Yes, I will. I will type in the chat box right now. So Tenalloway Farm is the name of the um, of the farm that makes walnut syrup, and um, he seems like a really nice guy. Let's see. Uh,
I think you hit all the
all
questions.
right,
This
cool.
this is like this is I'm just fascinated by this. This is a I gotta thank Steve Robarge again for connecting you and I. So um and these were great questions. So thanks to the participants who stuck around, or I'm sorry, so we had 50, the majority of people stuck around. Thanks to those of you who jumped in and asked those very thoughtful questions. So I will, when David sends me the PDF, and David, are you willing to entertain? I know you're a graduate student, you've got lots going on, so maybe you'd not like to be directly. If you're welcome to put your either your email address in the chat or on your presentation or not, and um, I guess as people will find you with Google no matter what if they're trying to get a hold of you. So
Yes, I'd
um,
love to, anytime you guys have questions about this, I'd be happy to answer it. I'll put my email address in the chat.
okay, super. And David will be back again tonight at 7 o'clock. Same presentation, but you can. So usually when I see things, I always second time, third time, fourth time, I still always learn something new. So you all are welcome back. David, thank you. I hope you have a great afternoon and everybody else. And we'll reconnect at about 6:50 or so this evening.
That sounds great. Thank you very much again, Peter. I appreciate it.
Yes, thank you. Great job. Really appreciate
All
your
right.
effort. All right.
Yep. See you tonight. Thank you.
Yep.